Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Very, very real pleasure to be here.
From many aspects, it is the hardest time ever in the aviation industry, but I'm a positive person and I think you can find some positive angles on that as well. For example, a week ago, I didn't know you exist. And now we are talking together, recording an interview. So that's definitely one of the positives. So before we get into it, how I found you, maybe you can start with sharing with us a little bit of your personal aviation journey. When and how did it all start, and how you made it to where you are today?
My personal aviation journey is very much a long haul journey. I grew up in Australia, and I went to university in Sydney, but also in Japan. And so a quarter of my law degree is in Japanese. And then when I started working in a law firm in Sydney, and that law firm had as one of its clients Japan Airlines. And at the time, and we're talking 1988, 1989, Japan Airlines was working with Qantas on buying shares in Air New Zealand, one of the very first airline privatisations in the world. And so at the time, Qantas had gone from having practically no interest in Japan, they had 4 flights a week or something, to suddenly Japan, in Japan, they woke up to what an amazing place Australia is, and it became an enormous tourism destination. Cute koalas, kangaroos, all that stuff. And which we're happy to bank on. And Qantas had gone from 4 flights a week to Japan to 21 flights a week in about 2 seasons. It had become a really massive new market, and they frankly had very little Japanese expertise or understanding. In the course of the privatisation process, Japan Airlines, bought shares from Qantas in Air New Zealand. And so the Qantas guys heard me speaking Japanese, and the next thing you know, the chief executive of Qantas Airways rang me and said, "Would you like to come over for a drink?" And I got offered a job in Qantas. I thought at the time it was going to be me never being a lawyer again. I was in charge of commercial projects. We did all sorts of things. We reorganised how we did our stuff in Japan, which was very needed to be brought up to speed and up to date. I organised the merger of 2 CRSs in Australia that were competing and put them into an industry company, which also meant writing a code of conduct. I introduced the frequent flyer scheme into Qantas, and then I was asked to be in charge of the due diligence for the privatisation of Qantas. In the course of that, I was made Chief Legal Officer of Qantas as well, and so then I spent several years as Chief Legal Officer of Qantas. Part of that also meant, part of that journey also meant that I spent some time as the country manager for Thailand and some time as the regional director for Japan as well. And then I got offered a job, or then I was in conversations and got offered a job with IATA in Geneva, moved to Geneva in 1996, thinking that I was there for a couple of years, a bit of fun, learned some French. We had 2 young children. And 25 years later, I'm still here. I moved from IATA. I started in the legal department and then moved to being the Director of Government and Industry Affairs at IATA. And then I moved to being the Director of Industry and Government Affairs, same thing, only backwards, at CETA. And then 15 years ago, I started out on my own, because to put all that into a journey, whilst my training is in law, my interest in aviation is very strongly in policy, very strongly in how do we write the rules to make it better, how do we write the rules to get a sensible competitive industry, and how do we throw off the shackles of the 75 years now that we've been burdened with the Chicago Convention and a structure which arguably from 1975, certainly from 1990 onwards, is clearly not fit for purpose, and we need to change the policy, the way in which the aviation industry operates, to make it a more commercial, more normal business.
When do you think that it will happen?
Well, I'm an old man, so I can't imagine it happening in my life. You're a younger man, maybe it'll happen in yours. You would have thought, Juris, you would have thought, wouldn't you, that this crisis, this incredible crisis that we've got on at the moment, would be the moment. If not now, when? And I'm heartened to hear that there are now some people, apart from myself, that have been beating this drum, that have been trying to push for some change. I think we need to change in all sorts of directions. We clearly need to change things like the ownership and control restrictions. I find it an outrage that an airline's capacity to raise capital is limited by its geography, not by the quality of its business plan. I just think that's beyond stupid. And then all the other issues about post holders and nationalities of management and all those sorts of things is crazy. The reality is we don't have international, there's no such thing as an international airline at the moment. There's only national airlines that sometimes fly to other countries. And I think that's bizarre and we need to change that. So I'd like to see that sort of stuff change. I see no role for ICAO in anything to do with the commercial aspects of aviation. That we have an intergovernmental safety-focused organisation is, of course, completely right and completely proper, but I think that's where it should start and stop. I'd like to see a complete renegotiation, what's the word I'm after here, a reimagining of the relationship between the airlines and airports, and of the airlines and the air navigation service providers as well. And you'd have thought the crisis would allow us to do that. If you think about it from the perspective or what that might look like going forward, I think the reality of where we are at the moment is that by the end of this crisis, there will be fewer airlines in the world, for better or worse. And obviously, it's not good if you work for one of the airlines that isn't there. Of course not, I understand that. But there will be fewer airlines. The airlines will have smaller fleets, and they'll have smaller fleets of smaller aeroplanes, in fact. So I think there's going to have to be a reimagining of that. But that puts enormous pressure on airports. And at the moment, the airport business model is to attract as many airlines as possible to them. I think going forward, the only option for most airports is to be as attractive as possible to an airline. And to be really attractive to the airline, I think they have to offer an airline really focused customer-centric service, which includes things like making sure that the long-haul aeroplane that comes into gate 1 and comes in first, and which allows the transferring passengers to be transferred, the transferring passengers' baggage to be transferred. That flight should come into gate 1, not gate 250. And then the other stuff can come out from that. For that to happen, not only do you need an airport that's focused on the airline, on its customers, of course, I think you've got to start to look at some of the air traffic control issues as well. I would think the sensible solution here is for the airport to take over the tower, its local tower and its local TMA, terminal movement area, so that it controls the way in which it can offer service to an airline. What we end up with, I think, going forward is going to be fewer airlines, but hopefully if my vision were to be seen, but they'd be international companies offering a networked, integrated global service with very much customer-centric thinking, where it's quite possible that my global network uses slightly different airports to your global network, offers different services. And so not only would the air navigation service provider have a different role at the airport and at the terminal edge, but I think I can see no good reason why an ANSP, for example, shouldn't be embedded in an airline's ops centre, so that the airline is getting one provider, which then works with other providers as needs must. I also don't understand, now that we're talking ANSP for a moment, I don't quite understand why we continue to control aeroplanes as if it's 1945 using radar and VHF radio. Radar and VHF radio, they are both World War I technologies, remarkably. And when we move to satellite-based technologies, we continue to think that the satellite can see a border, an international border. It's just magical thinking of the worst possible kind. It's witchcraft, really, more than anything else. So we need to find different ways to reimagine that. It's interesting, isn't it, that in the military, aircraft are controlled by mission, entire trajectory, start to finish. And yet we continue to believe somehow or other that controlling aircraft by sectors is the right solution. It has no logical background. The only reason why we do it is because that's how we used to do it. And I think if ever there was a moment where we could change some of that stuff, where we don't have to do what we used to do, it's surely now. And so I'd like to see a lot of changes. I'm old, but I'm still pushing. I still believe there's a chance for a
That's
bit more
fantastic.
change.
That's fantastic to hear. And there were a couple of moments that I wanted to interrupted you, but I saw that you are
I
in
was on a flow, wasn't I?
exactly, exactly.
Sorry.
I just didn't want to damage it. Um, Lots of follow-up questions already on my mind, but let's come back to the beginning. So to your journey. So I guess it's quite difficult to say, but if you can try. Which part of it was the most enjoyable for you?
The day we privatized Qantas was very enjoyable.
That
The day
day.
we saw the day we saw Qantas pop up on the Australian Stock Exchange, that was a bit of fun. For me, the journey has been learning about this remarkable industry and learning about how it all fits together and how very complicated it is, and how modern airlines, and indeed old airlines, call for people with such an amazingly different array of skills and experts in all of them. And I've really enjoyed that, and I've enjoyed learning. I enjoy the fact that every day I still learn, to be frank. I know that's a really trite answer. That's what people always say in these sorts of things, but it's absolutely true that I can't remember a day when I didn't think, well, that's something interesting or new that I didn't know before. So that's always been exciting. I think it's been really interesting to meet a lot of really nice people as well. Again, that's a please edit that bit out. That's a really soppy answer. But,
I'll make sure I'll keep it in there because
no, please don't.
It's totally true. I mean,
that's for the cutting room. That's for the editing room floor. It's you meet nice people. You meet you have to address some really interesting challenges. There's also, I think, the really interesting challenge of trying to operate with modern technologies, with modern equipment, an industry that's regulated as if we still didn't invent the jet engine and we're still using radars. So bringing together the very obvious and important requirements of safety, requirements of international comity, with trying to be competitive. And I've been very lucky because, again, my journey started in 1989 when airlines weren't terribly competitive one with the other, when there'd been deregulation in the US, but the deregulation in Europe, for example, was still to happen. And so I've been lucky enough to be part of trying to push aviation to be more and more competitive, which, I will go to my grave believing is a good thing to be in a competitive industry. But I also accept and acknowledge that one of the most remarkable things about aviation is the ways in which it does have to work together for all sorts of reasons. So if there's one moment in my life, perhaps, where I remember, it must have been in 1991, perhaps, I don't know. And it was 6 a.m. on a very cold morning in Toulouse. I walked up to the check-in counter for Air France. I put my suitcase on the scales. I was flying Air France, Toulouse, London, British Airways, London, Tokyo, Qantas Airways, Tokyo, Sydney. So that's a ticket in those days, well, even today, in 3 different currencies, involving 3 different airlines. I put my bag on the baggage belt. I got to Sydney and my luggage came out. That is one of the single most remarkable pieces of industrial engineering in the history of the world. We're really bad at promoting it. We're really bad at acknowledging it for what it is, which is a miracle.
Yeah, we take it for granted.
Sorry?
We take it just for granted.
We do take it for granted, and as an industry, we let our interline system effectively be poached by the alliances who try to capitalise on it. But actually, it's an underlying industry system, the interline system, that is one of the most remarkable pieces of industrial engineering in the history of the world. And you're right, we take it for granted. We certainly don't let people see just how cooperative and clever and innovative we can be. To think through that process is remarkable. That there was an agreed fare in different currencies that was reconciled. Air France put in it. My original sector was on a Qantas ticket, of course. So Air France would have sent in their invoices for carrying me that sector, and then of course my bag made it because we've got agreed standards on barcodes and on airport airport 3-letter codes and all that stuff. It really cuts across almost everything in aviation. I find it genuinely remarkable. And at feeling less than 100%, it's fair to say, when I arrived in Sydney 30 or so hours later, to see my bag come up, it still fills me with awe.
Amazing. I've seen different sorts of F geeks over the last couple of years. I'm within the industry. I consider myself being one, but you are a proper aviation geek, not the one that just looks for the aircraft all the time and knows how you can spot an aircraft from, I don't know what, 2,000 meters, but you are a proper industry lover.
I'm the worst of all av geeks, because I'm not an av geek. I'm an aviation industry geek.
Exactly.
I can't I can recognize aeroplanes and, all that stuff. And I have absolutely zero interest in flying. I think, I run the risk of upsetting a lot of people here. I think that if you took the fancy hat away from most pilots, it'd be very hard to justify what they're doing. One man and a dog on the cockpit, et cetera, et cetera. I've known all the jokes. But whenever I look at an aeroplane, I try to work out, how is that thing making money? How do we make this commercially a better industry? I'm to the extent I'm an av geek, I'm actually an industry geek.
Brilliant. So many people, including myself, then have discovered you thanks to the Eurocontrol Aviation HardTalks, where you are interviewing some of the most respected leaders of our industry.
After 30 years, I'm an overnight sensation. Yeah.
Definitely to me. From the interviews you've done on this platform, which were the most memorable thoughts you've heard, maybe, and which leader truly surprised you, potentially, with what he said?
He or she. I've spoken to men and women.
Oh, sorry,
unfortunately, fewer women than you'd want.
Yeah.
I know I've been doing hard talks.
The next one will be a lady. If I'm right.
The next one is indeed. I've been doing these hard talks, in fact, for quite some time. You've only seen 3 of them because only 3 have been streamed, but I've been doing them for Eurocontrol for 2 years now. Okay. And I've interviewed all sorts of people. The format in the old days, when we were actually doing them live in front of an audience at Eurocontrol, was slightly longer. So I was lucky enough to also have the capacity to go a little bit more slowly and to learn people's backstories, where they studied, what they did, what got them into aviation. Plus, of course, some really important, I think they're really important questions in what I call the quick fire round, which is things like football or rugby, the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, those sorts of important issues, which actually I think tell people a lot more about them than they might realise. Most interesting things that have been said.
So I definitely enjoyed your talk with Peter Elbers last week.
Yeah, it was good, wasn't it? I have to say, I hadn't met Peter other than to shake his hand once years ago. And I was really impressed by Peter, that I was impressed by Willie Walsh and that I was impressed by Joseph Verratti. Doesn't surprise me because they're impressive people that have got quite a high public profile. Whereas Peter Elbers are very much more in the background, very much more industry born and raised. I thought what he was saying was very sensible.
Absolutely.
I'm trying to think of an answer to your question. For me, most of the fun in the hard talks is actually having them. I think I was lucky enough to interview Johan Lundrum from EasyJet, discovering that his first training was as a trombonist was, I think, quite fun. You see, I think that's really interesting. I think it's much more important than discovering their views on spreadsheet-based stuff, in all honesty. How they manage, I think, comes out much more from that sort of stuff. And I think anyone who's played in an orchestra knows about being in a team. So that probably was my most fun. Because I also got to say it must be good. He grew up in the country in Sweden, and I said, yes, if you're learning how to be a trombonist, I'd imagine being in the country is good because you've got to be a long way from anybody else. Because for the first 3 years of learning the trombone, it's basically farting noises. And I think the fact that I got away with saying farting noises was good too. Yeah.
For sure. And I can't wait for you to be interviewing Michael OLeary later this year.
Well, I've interviewed Michael a couple of times. I've interviewed Michael. He's always fun. Yeah. I mean, you've got to draw it out of him a little bit. He's a bit shy. He doesn't like to say stuff. He's not all that opinionated.
Are you talking about the same person that me?
I think it's fair to say one person I interviewed, I won't name names here, one person I interviewed though for an earlier hard talk. I was actually on the tram heading out to Eurocontrol for the recording or for the interview, and this person said to me about today, "I'm more a listener than a talker," which I thought, oh, here we go, because it's not called hard listen, it's called hard talk, but it's fair to say that Michael OLeary isn't more of a listener than a talker. And let me tell you the other thing that has come out for me. I think most of the people who get to the top in this industry, and as I say, I've done something in the order of 15 hard talks now, they're smart. They're smart people. And I take some comfort from that. I really do. Because us normal people, I enjoy talking to people who are smart because I learn so much.
Absolutely. I guess we can agree that this is the hardest time in the history of our industry.
Not going to get an argument from me. No.
Yeah. So even though you've been quite skeptic in the last couple of minutes, what do you think, if there is something or somebody who will lead us out of this crisis?
Well, at the moment, I have to say there has been let me be frank and honest. And I think if we have a problem at the moment, there is a dearth of leadership. I've been in some conversations with friends of mine who are close to IATA, and I'm heartened by some of the things that they are saying behind the scenes, but it's got to be said at the front at the moment. Maybe they're saving themselves for a big performance. They're going to leave it all out on the field at some later point. I would like to see, we've spent a lot of time desperately trying as an industry, whether we're talking the airlines or the regulators, we've spent an enormous amount of time, wasted time in my view, and money, which is much more criminal, desperately trying to preserve the way we used to do stuff, which is, I think, outrageous that we've done that. I think, and we've spent an enormous amount of time and energy trying to get back to the status quo. And I think we shouldn't be looking for the status quo. I think what we should be doing now, where we should be spending all of our thinking and all of our energy, is not preserving the slot rules so that we don't change the way the system used to be in 2019. Remember 2019 is this mythical
Actually,
time from the past.
I have a follow-up.
I have a different industry.
Yeah, I have a follow-up questions about 2019.
Your grandchildren will look at 2019 the way you and I look at 1841. So why we're desperately trying to put everything in ASPIC and preserve it. The slot rules is a case in point. A bunch of the other things, all these bailouts. I think there's a time and a place for bailing out. I'm not against states giving airlines money, but I think we've got to very quickly come to the realisation that we're bailing, but the hole is below the waterline in many cases. We should be honouring good businesses, not all businesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to my follow-up question, which is asked very often, so I want to hear your view on that. So do you think we will ever come back to the 2019 traffic levels? No. And is it even necessary?
Traffic levels?
I mean, yeah, the amount, how big the industry actually was in 2019.
Can I just say, I think there's a lot of mythical thinking going on about all this. IATA's figures are clear. IATA's figures are on the 1st of January this year. So let's call it the end of 2019. There were 30 profitable airlines in the world. That's not some mythical nirvana we should be getting back to. Remember, in 2019 in Europe, there were ATM delays of over an hour. And we haven't started to talk about the environment yet. Let's start to. Just because we used to do it that way doesn't mean we should do it that way tomorrow, and it doesn't mean it was better. And people need to think through some of these things. And desperately throwing more of taxpayers' money at airlines just so we don't have to change anything is a very brave strategy for a government, a very brave strategy. will we ever get back to 2019's levels? Well, oh, golly, that's a hard question, because for a start, I think a lot of business travel is going to be reshaped by what's going on. You and I are talking by Zoom. I talk to industry leaders on hard talks by Zoom. Well, it's not actually, it's Teams, but that's a different point. I don't think people will, I think business travel will return, I really do. But I think what will happen is that instead of flying to Brussels or Canberra or wherever for a 3-hour meeting, or even maybe a 3-hour meeting and then an overnight and flying out again or something like that, I think those days are gone. I think you're going to fly to somewhere and you will then organise as many meetings as you can for the one flight. If you like, I sometimes say to people, increasingly people are all going to travel like an Australian businessman. You don't, if you're coming from Sydney or Melbourne, you don't fly to London for a 3-hour meeting, unless you're working in an airline. You fly to London, you have your 3-hour meeting, you organise 10 other meetings with other people, you then go to Frankfurt and have 5 meetings over there, or Brussels or whatever, and then you come home. You maximise the flight. I can imagine a moment or a situation soon where procurement managers, travel managers or whatever for companies say, of course you can travel, of course you can fly. You've got one flight a quarter. So I think business travel is going to change for the foreseeable future. And so I think that's going to be interesting, and that will make it difficult. The second issue, I think, there is that there will be a huge amount of people wanting to finally catch up with family and friends and what have you. But in the meantime, we've learned how to have holidays close to home, things like that. So I think there'll be a bit of a rebalancing there. And there will be people travelling. I have no question with that. But then the third point is we also have to factor back across the environmental and the sustainability point in all of this. And that is going to put pressure on. I don't think that the conservation movement, the greenies, to use the pejorative term, I don't think they're going to give us a free pass. The fact that we've gone through a very hard time doesn't of itself justify then getting back to emitting emissions in the way that we were. There's such a long way to go before we get over those problems. There's work being done in sustainable fuels, but they still emit, and at the moment they're very small in the total share of emissions. Airbus has put forward plans for hydrogen-based aeroplanes, but you're looking at 30 years out for that. I think there's going to be, flight shaming was real, and I think there's going to be enormous pressure on some of that stuff. And that's before you start to think about quarantine rules and all those sorts of things. So,
actually, that was supposed to be my second question about sustainability. No worries about sustainability. And I wanted to ask, do you think that we as an industry are doing enough? I mean, obviously, we are probably not. So, is there anything that you think that is like realistic we can do relatively quickly?
Just we're doing it really well at the moment. We're not flying. Whether we're doing enough I think depends on which side, where you sit depends on where you stand, doesn't it? I think that we think that we're doing quite a lot. I think that the environmental movement thinks we're not doing anything like enough. And so there's a massive trust shortfall there. And the environmental movement is determined to reduce emissions further. They acknowledge the only way to do that in the short to medium term is to reduce flying. So we need to look at that. Reducing flying, almost the issue comes back to, and we haven't had a sensible conversation. We have not had a sensible conversation about taxation, about fuel tax, about those, APDs, those sorts of things. To the extent that the industry has an argument about this, the argument is that if we're going to pay money, then that money should go back to be dedicated to research into sustainable fuels and so forth. That's an argument which, again, that's so classically aviation bubble thinking. That's so classically aviation special. Aviation isn't special. We're just part of the milieu. We just think we're special, and it's not the same thing. And from a government perspective, they look at that and say, really, we should specifically put that money into aviation fuels. What, instead of education, public health? I think if we've learnt nothing in the last 6 months, it's that public health is actually quite important. And that, maybe we need to think a little bit more about how we spend our money. And And if we're going to have conversations about where we spend our taxation and how we raise money, then, I think aviation's got an argument for putting it into sustainable fuels to some extent, but it's got to be a thoughtful argument. It's got to be well put. And at the moment, it's an argument that the aviation industry is losing, very frankly, watching what I see, knowing the other forces at work. Because to a very large extent in aviation, we are a classic example of the Stockholm Syndrome. We and the aviation regulators are in love with each other because we both know we're very special. And that's terrific until you've actually got to talk about something that goes outside the bubble and the sustainability debate, emissions, environment, all that is outside the aviation bubble.
I can see that. I mean, we can be discussing for another hour or so, and I hope we will catch up maybe later in time, in few months, for another catch up. But let me close today's discussion with a few questions. So the first one is there anything positive you can say about the future of aviation? Anything with a little ray of hope?
I think, yes, there's plenty of positive stuff out there. I think we're looking at really, if we're clever, we can reform this industry in a way that we've been unable to reform it for 75 years, or that we had a big surge of reformation between 75 and 95. We could go back, we could get to a golden era again where we actually redesign and rescope and restructure the entire industry, and that would be terrific. I think there's hope that...
But how realistic is that will happen? Or who should lead?
What do you want? Realistic or hopeful? You asked for a ray of hope.
Realistic hope.
Oh, realistic hope. Yeah, right. Next. Is there a ray of hope in the future? I wish I could say more conclusively yes to that. There's a lot of people who I think are going to learn enormous amounts from what we're doing, and I think that those that are left will be strong, and that will be good. And there will be clearly pent-up demand for aviation, clearly pent-up demand for what we do. I think there's a growing community that demands that we do it more responsibly, which I think is a good thing. I think we're going to... There's a lot of stuff out there. I think some of the stuff that's going on in the urban aerial mobility area, I think gives us rays of hope, because that's where the electric propulsion is going to start. I think it's where we're going to start to see people doing different things. Again, it's going to see a different structure of how we relate to the regulator, who the regulator is. Local government is going to get involved in a way that it's never been involved in aviation before. I think there's plenty of things that are out there, new technologies that give us hope. Maybe redefining the way in which we do aviation is going to give us hope. Even the move from big aeroplanes to small aeroplanes, and then down to flying taxis. I mean, I think you could either look at that as the atomization of aviation, which I think is a dystopian way, or you can look at it as, increasingly aviation becomes democratized, and I think that might be a good thing too.
Excellent. Where do people can find you? So
thank you for asking.
If they want to...
Thank you.
Yeah.
I write a document called the Aviation Intelligence Reporter. It has a remarkable number of subscribers who have been very loyal even through these crises. And it includes very senior regulators, senior airline people, ANSPs, airports. Aviation, if you go to www.aviationadvocacy.aero, obviously, and ask to subscribe, but nothing would give me more pleasure. I'm also, I do these sorts of things. I write, I try to lobby, I comment, I write for Forbes magazine as well. So, I'm around.
Yeah, I'll make sure.
Some of us have only found me through HardTalk, but I've been about.
I'll make sure I'll add the link to your website in the show notes.
Please, I'd be very delighted. That would be very kind of you. Thank you.
And very last questions for today. What do you love the most about aviation?
Whoa. The most.
Yeah.
Like I say, I grew up in rural Australia. I live in Switzerland. I've met people from all over the world. I've had a really remarkable career. I've done all sorts of interesting stuff, met all sorts of interesting people, and smart people, and I really love that. I love that it's given me an out. Rural Australia is all very fun and well, but there's a time and a place.
Yeah, I understand. And by the way, Australia is on my bucket list as well. I've never been there.
It's on everybody. That's the problem for Australian tourism. It's on everybody's bucket list, but they only ever want to go there once, and it's going to be their trip of their lifetime. That kind of stuff. So it's the tyranny of distance for Australia. It's a great place. It's a great place to go. It's a great place to visit. Mm-hmm. Football grand final is this weekend, so that'll make it. I'll be there in spirit this weekend.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrew. It was a true pleasure to talk to you today.
My pleasure.